the Survivalist Podcast with Mark Puhale and Matt Gould. In each episode of the Survivalist Podcast, we look at different events and catastrophes that could happen in different areas of the world. Then we give you the knowledge, resources, and recommendations you need to survive. We'll explore scenarios from a worldwide financial collapse to a coordinated terrorist attack to a global climate catastrophe and everything in between. The Survivalist Podcast is brought to you by Survival Cash, Ford Survival Supply, and theBugoutRace.com. Please visit our website, thesurvivalistpodcast.com, for more information or to give us feedback. And now, the Survivalist Podcast with Mark Puhale and Matt Gould.
Welcome to the Survivalist Podcast. It's been about a month since we've done one, and Mark and I have both been traveling quite a bit all over the place, and in fact, today Mark is not available to join us. So we have a great guest host here in Doc, Montana, and he is a frequent contributor to Survival Cash. I'm really excited to have him here because he's such an expert on all things. And Doc, actually tell me a little bit more about yourself, if you would.
Sure. On the survival side, I tend to approach things not from the military or Leo aspect, but more for the adventure travel and the craziness of ending up in situations and in places around the globe and, you know, working my way out of it. But I write for Survival Cash mainly. I do a lot with knives, with Bugout aspects, occasionally guns, occasionally ammo solutions. But really, I'm interested in what I have with me and what it allows me to do. And I do a lot of reading on it, a lot of writing, and I just enjoy kind of consuming the sides of this coin that we work with survival, with bugging out, with dealing with unrest, with natural disasters.
As you know, in every episode, we take on a topic and we look at what kind of things you'd have to do to prepare for it and what are the odds of it happening. Today, I want to go through two topics. One that I think is very timely, which is the possibility of election riots, meaning that, you know, there's a lot of unrest in both of our political parties and seems to be pretty widespread unhappiness with our political system, no matter who you're supporting or, you know, if whatever party you're affiliated with, people are very unhappy, I think, more so than I've seen in my lifetime. Maybe not in my lifetime, but in my adult lifetime. And so I want to talk about that. And the next thing is just to continue on what we were talking about last episode, bug out bags and everyday carry items. And we want to continue that discussion by talking about long-term survival strategies. And I know, Doc, you're an expert on that. Back in March, Donald Trump made a statement that, you know, if he didn't get the nomination, if there was a broken convention in Cleveland, then his people would rally and there would be riots. Do you remember that, Doc?
Oh, yes, very much.
And it looks like everyone is rallying around him, but that sentiment that, you know, there will be riots and in some ways he would even perhaps instigate the riots, well, is a pretty scary sentiment, I think, coming from someone who could be president of the United States. Well, what is an election riot?
Well, basically, a riot is any kind of like a violent public disturbance. It's not a peaceful, organized way of expressing dissatisfaction. So what actually happens a lot of times is a group of people get together and then start going after something. And there can be communal riots where you're basically against a person or a race or a group. There can be commodity riots where it could be food or fuel or anything that is, you know, some physical substance. There are riots over the protest of the government or a philosophical feeling, and there can be celebration riots. Obviously, you know, a Super Bowl or World Series or something where people just are just expressing themselves in kind of a violent way. So one of the problems when I look at the Trump statement has to do with dissecting the psychology of it to try to get some predictive keys in order to respond to it. And that's where I find some of this, fascinating and confusing and scary, because if you talk to people about it, there's sort of this general acceptance that something could happen, whether it's wanted or not, just because it's out there. And what I see going on now might not be as much a riot as a revolt. And a revolt actually is a more powerful movement. It's riots, to use a pun, kind of burn themselves out. They can't keep going because people get tired of it, or there's no real end game. They're just angry, and then they get, start things on fire or fight with people, and then it sort of ends. But a revolt starts to build up its own momentum. And I think when Trump was talking about the potential of a riot, he was actually building on feelings that, like you said, they're part of our country, part of our reaction to government, and especially with the Bundy Ranch and the Oregon Wildlife Refuge standoff, we can see these things are out there, and there are people who want to participate. And I guess that's the psychology of it.
It's neither the left nor the right that seems predisposed towards riots. It's both. Riot.
Yeah, I mean, the politics aside, there's a general feeling. In fact, you could probably use Trump as a symbol more than actually a political stand or a lightning rod or something that other politicians, you seem to be able to kind of hang particular issues on them. Trump doesn't really hold well to that, but instead he becomes kind of a focal point for general dissatisfaction. And the way that you can kind of identify that is if you look at, okay, let's say there is a riot, or let's say there is a revolt, define the enemy. And that's where it gets really fuzzy. People have some nebulous idea that they're unhappy about, somebody's going to take their guns or health care, or bathrooms or building a wall or something. But let's say, how do you riot over building a wall? Or how do you revolt against that, for it or against it? I mean, what exactly is there to deal with? And that's when it gets a little scary, is because there's just general festering anger. And that's when it becomes unpredictable. So it's not as if, okay, we'll make everyone happy. Everyone get your shovels, we'll go build a wall. It doesn't work that way. Who's the enemy? Is it the left? Well, what's left? I mean, here in Montana, our left is probably fairly right. In New York, the right might be, considerably left of our left. In fact, here in Montana, I don't know if I mentioned this once before, but one of our senators, our senator actually had a higher NRA rating than one of the representatives. The senator was a Democrat, the representative was a Republican, and a former Navy SEAL. So the NRA gave a higher rating to the Montana Democrat than to a former Navy SEAL, who actually just introduced Trump, by the way, in Billings, Montana, and I believe is hoping for a cabinet post or a VP slot or something. It's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
So it really doesn't work. Who's the enemy? And that's when the idea of bugging out starts to make a little sense, because if you've got just unstructured anger, it's very difficult to predict it, to avoid it. And in history, I mean, America is filled with different riots over beer, over tea, over taxes, over race, over decisions, but they tend to burn out pretty quick, and then we try to make everyone happy. But if it turns to a revolt, then it's like we need to take over, and then we'll figure it out, and that's where it's dangerous. Would it figure what out?
Right.
What's the ideological point behind the anger? And there isn't. That's where.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I guess a lot of times, is it possible that a riot could spark a revolt? That it's something that starts as a riot turns into a long-standing revolt?
It easily. I think we saw some of that with Occupy, like the Occupy Wall Street movement, till it started to get a little heated. But then I think the whole idea of an unstructured organization, if you will, turned out to fizzle, because once it started to get some momentum, there was nobody driving. And so the car went off the road. And then people were, well, this is dumb. We needed to have done something, and we're not. And now we're losing momentum. We're losing press. We're losing the ability to affect change because there's nobody saying, okay, here are the things we want besides this, global back down of Wall Street. Even if you were one of the Wall Street people, one of the 1%, you'd go, well, what would make you happy? And there was no clear answer,
Right.
which means how do you work with it? But again, that wasn't a gun-filled rage. That was, people, sitting on sidewalks.
Yeah, that was pretty orderly as far as it goes. But, we've had riots in the last couple of years in various cities around the country. Seems like if I look back historically, it seems like 1968 was really the year of the riot in America, right?
You're talking kind of recent memory, but yes, there were probably more around 68 than any other single year. But if you add in the idea of all of the kind of the convergence of elements that were going on, the change in politics, the Vietnam War, the race riots, segregation, integration, also where massive scientific changes, going to the moon was coming up. I mean, people were on edge. Then, of course, we had a president assassinated a few years earlier. We had the president's brother assassinated. You had Martin Luther King. So there were a lot of things that probably made us very reactionary. But then, there were also lots of probably 1,000 times more nonviolent actions that don't show up in a riot because people were sitting on railroad tracks or sitting in a diner or sitting on a bus, when it turned into an arrest. And so I think the general discontent was quite large there. I think two differences today. One is massive communication, especially with social media, and the other is the ability to move weapons around during a riot or a revolt. So, I mean, if you look back, 68, most people didn't have AR-15s. Did they even exist? They had the M16, but so there's a big change. And if you look, that's become that the AR-15 is kind of the symbol of the new come and take it, the new I'm going to stand my ground here. You saw them as a symbol in Nevada at the Bundy Ranch. You see them as a symbol in the
Oregon. It was Oregon, right?
Yeah, Oregon, and that's different than somebody waving around an old Chief Special 38. It just doesn't carry the same weight. And I'll talk about that with it when we get into long-term bugging out, because that actually may be exactly the message you want. Not only is it's not a come and take it, it's a don't mess with me. And so then things are a little different. So again, going back to the psychology aspect, I think it's important to have some understanding of what steps play out, kind of reading history, reading the psychology, to figure out what a group would do, because the mob mentality, it's well studied, but it's also terribly frightening. And some would say that, maybe we're posed for that at our particular point in our democracy or republic, for something to happen to help clarify what exactly we are.
Right. I mean, I think this is what people say. We're in a late stage or very mature democracy or representative democracy where people don't feel like they have a voice. People feel that corruption in the government is at an all-time high. Whether it is or not, that's what they feel, I think. People see the government gridlock in that, our system of checks and balances has done too well in a way, right? So that nobody can do anything in the government. And then there's much more divisiveness, I guess, between people than ever before. So if you're a staunch Republican, you couldn't even imagine being a Democrat, or you can't even imagine the types of things they say, right? And so And then you get someone, you get some politicians who try to exploit that by sort of demonizing the other side.
Mm.
Um, and then you couple all that with the massive income and ever accelerating income inequality that we have. And so I would say, I guess I'm one of them that says there is bound to be something that happens in the near future. And is that thing going to be a revolt? And so if it were, how do you think it would play out? Would it come like around a political process like an election? Would it start there?
Well, I guess in my optimistic thinking, there could be something big and tragic, but as America, looks at it like we have some of the tragedies in the past, we would come together and, not quite put aside our differences, but realize that we aren't, um, the only ship in this ocean. Russia and China are constantly watching us. We've got the whole aspect of energy and food and trade that we have to keep sort of stable, or we'll undo, maybe our currency standing in the world. And I think it's easy to argue, within the family, but once it starts going outside, we have to be very careful because that can affect us in multiple ways that none of us want. But I do believe that we're going to have some sort of a cathartic release, if you will, where not necessarily me or you, but this element that's just festering. And part of it is to clarify it, because once you get into some physical site, there's probably some philosophical stand you have to have. And I don't believe a lot of people have thought it that far. They're just generally angry. It's like road rage. They didn't wake up angry. They didn't start out angry. It's just this combination of events that took place in a short amount of time made them want to react. And I think if you get enough of those people together, that's when you start having some sort of a violent confrontation. But over what?
Right.
I mean, where would you draw the lines? What exactly are the list of demands? And that's where a lot of these, anger-filled, like you mentioned, the Bernie Sanders supporters going after the Trump supporters. What exactly do you want? And they probably just want revenge, whatever that is. They're just angry. They want something to happen, and they feel like nothing's happening, so they're going to make something happen. But even that's a small percentage of America. That's just the one that we get through the social media and through the news, the story on. But I mean, I don't know anyone involved, and I mean the whole group of those who were oppressed and those who attacked. I don't know, how 50 people. Would that have even made the news a few years ago? But now we, in this 24-hour news cycle, we feel like there's just this constant flood of issues surfacing and anger, and we've got to do something, and it doesn't matter who it is. Some people are even saying it doesn't matter. Just do something, and then we'll start over again. And that's when I start looking at Russia and China, thinking they probably are interested in us starting over again. But
Yes.
that's not quite what we want.
No, although China, hard to say because they're so interdependent with us, right? Like who would they sell their stuff to if we had to start over?
Yeah, they're even no matter how nostalgic you are about the history of America, these interminglings are always going on. We even see that, if you go to some repressive culture like North Korea, there is a whole lot of stuff that happens under the radar. We saw it in Iraq. We see it in Afghanistan. You even see it in Saudi Arabia. There's this surface appearance of what's supposed to be going on, but then there's all kinds of stuff happening under the radar that keeps it actually rolling along. There's a lot of pretend too.
Right. So let's say maybe we could talk about some practical tips, maybe. So let's
Sure.
say that you're in Philadelphia or for the Democratic convention, or you're in Cleveland for the Republican convention, and something gets out of hand, and people start, attacking the police officers there, and what would they do? They'd start with rocks, stones, maybe just fists. breaking stuff, looting, starting fires. I mean,
Yeah.
those.
Well,
eh,
there's a couple of ways to look at that. If you want to participate, then all bets are off. If you're talking actually about what we talk about usually on Survival Cache and SHTF blog, it's surviving, it's moving on, it's staying out of the way. And if you think about the definition of a riot, it's a public disturbance, which means there has to be a public presence. So that's why they tend to focus in downtowns and big cities rather than in some little town somewhere or over on the edge of the city. There isn't the mass of people there to make it worthwhile. So obviously, if the further away you get, the calmer it gets. And a lot of times, the news media runs to the fight, the police run to the fight, the EMS runs to the fight, any kind of government agency runs to the fight. So that's what we see. But one block over, there might be nothing going on. So obviously, distance is a big part of it.
Right.
So it's the initial hour maybe would be that critical time of how do I get out of wherever I am to somewhere else, and that can have implications as to what you're wearing. I got in the middle of a riot once in France. Turned a corner and I'm just wandering around, and here comes a whole bunch of battle-hardened, helmet-wearing, club-wielding police, full riot gear, and they're like 50 feet from me walking towards me. I turn around behind me and there's an angry group of protesters marching towards them. And I thought, how did this happen? I didn't even see it coming. And it's because I was, it was like a triangle. I came in one corner, the rioters came in on one side and the police came in the other, and all of a sudden I'm in the middle. So what did I do? Grab my camera equipment and pretended I was the press and kind of hung out right by the police till I could get behind them. All of a sudden I became invisible. I didn't become gray in terms of I was nondescript. I gave myself a role, and the role was not threatening. So, I was traveling around, so I had a camera. So, I used to do some photojournalism. And I just started playing the role as if I belonged there and I was not a threat until I could get past the police, which meant scooting by the edge where they were closing it off. But they saw what they wanted to see.
Yeah, that was fast thinking. So
I've run into a few situations that, you only have what you have. And, I was on a train once to Zagreb in the middle of the night, Zagreb, Croatia. And I didn't have a visa with me, and the security service at the time Yugoslavia took my passport, and I'm like, uh-oh, this isn't good.
Yeah.
I'll figure this out. And basically just super friendly, made a mistake, even though I totally knew what I was doing. And I had that blue passport book, which is like golden in America. They want to fight with you, but they don't really want to fight because it's, you make a few phone calls and all of a sudden you got, some bigwigs breathing down their neck. But this was right before Yugoslavia broke up into its civil war when I was down there. And, it was just like, oh, I understand. Everything's fine, and then I just kind of blend in and, and ended up having to go to the police station in the next town and talk to the people there, and everything's fine because I exuded zero threat. I was going to take whatever they gave me, even though I knew they just wanted, we're Americans. Regardless of what anyone thinks, there is some power just in being that. But I wasn't going to make them mad with it. And they saw what they wanted to see, and I quickly got out of there. Other people didn't.
Huh.
So it's, when I mentioned, like at the start of this, the adventure travel, I've been in all sorts of situations, and it's just, you let them win. I call it kind of the black lab strategy, or yellow lab in my case. Just roll over, expose the belly. It's a risky thing, but I've actually used a different language around other Americans who I knew were about to get in big trouble. I was going through East Berlin once, and some American college students took a car across the border they didn't have a proper paper for, and they started arguing. Guess what? They lost the car and they went to jail. I thought, well, that's kind of crazy, and they're looking at me, and I'm I'm like, no, no habla inglés.
Yeah.
You guys did this, but they thought they could just push their way through it. Instead, no, I became invisible.
Yeah.
People are perceiving, is it a threat or not? So if there was a riot, if I was in Philadelphia, and I wanted to get away from the riot, obviously there's that sick fascination of you'd love to see this thing play out, but I honestly I would be one of the huddled masses that's terrified, that's trying to move away quickly, and you'd probably be ignored, and you start putting distance on.
So you think you'd be ignored by the rioters? I can see you being ignored by the police since they don't see it as a threat, but you don't think that would just anger the rioters and make them come after you?
What kind of a reward would they get? Am I a threat? No. Am I a Leo of some kind? No. And what's the end game? And that's where I have to give them nothing of satisfaction. It's like a homeless person. I'm not part of this game, and you're going to gain nothing but wasted energy if you try to engage me.
Right.
I'm not going to get anything. It's a way of thinking. It's a mindset, and it has to be something that you can, you practice, and you can exude. A lot of people have trouble with it. It's like a total helplessness, even though you're thinking, okay, I could split your head open, using this tool in my pocket. But instead, it's like, whatever's wrong, I hope, it works out the best for you. I don't know what to do. I'd give you anything if I had it, whatever, till I can get behind you and take off. And that's a survival mentality.
Right. No,
it's not something that, most people have. They want to stand up for it, and you don't push me around. And I'm thinking, I got to get out of here, get back to my family. I'm not trying to save face. I'm trying to get behind you, and you can move on to the next target. So things can happen. Obviously, if it's a race riot, and I'm not the race that, I become a target, then I don't know. What else do I have? I mean, that's when I hate to say it, you can get really gross. You can vomit all over yourself. You can, start to do really weird things, and you become somebody they want to avoid. It's kind of what happens when you're assaulted. You can fight and be macho, or you can pee your pants and start yelling and, drooling and blow your nose down your face, just become this disgusting thing. And they don't want to have anything to do with you.
Yeah.
So their strategies, obviously you really have to not be paying attention. And the thing about the election riot, that's November 8th is the election date. So we know on a calendar that no matter what the discontent is, there won't be a reason to fire any shots until that date, because we don't know the outcome.
Right.
Whatever side you're on could win. November 24th is Thanksgiving. We're going into not only winter, but we're going into a holiday season, which is also disruptive. And here in Montana, that's in the middle of hunting season, so guns could be everywhere, and you
Right.
wouldn't know, is that because of the election riots, or is that because we're out deer hunting? So there's lots of confounding factors, but we do have a date on the calendar, unless something happens, unless some other event. But you have to pay attention to what's going on in the news to kind of predict. Now, if you look at the Bush-Gore election, we didn't have an answer the next morning.
Right.
We didn't have an answer for quite a while. If something like that happened, you'd have to then equate the growing discontent. I don't know what the average age of the rioters would be, and if they'd have, a memory of the situation back in 2000. But, literally there were all kinds of twists and turns, and I think most of us were just stunned. We didn't know what was going on. This was really weird. Nobody knew what to do, so nothing happened. It just festered.
Right.
But there was no real, people were yelling at I think it was Cheney's folks were yelling at the Gore folks to move on or get away. There was a little bit of animosity, but otherwise we were kind of lost. I don't think that'll happen here. I think people want an answer as soon as there's some feeling that things aren't quite right. The count was too close, or in the case of the 2000 election, Florida switched later, which caused maybe California voting to not do what it was originally going to do, or all the hanging chads, or the misaligned things. I mean, there were all kinds of craziness. I don't know if people will take that. I think that's when they would, stand up. And then if there was a leader that stood up, actually, it's not even the leader that's really important. It's the initial followers that give that leader power. Then something bad could happen, and that might lead to the second half of this podcast.
Right. Yeah. So let's say something does happen, and God willing, it doesn't. But our podcast is all about being prepared. So if it were to happen, now Mark and I had talked about what you need in your Bugout bag, and we went through it in great detail. I think Mark's bag would have been about 200 pounds, but he's a strong guy, so he could carry it all. I think he said he wanted a pistol and a shotgun and a rifle, and he wanted everything.
Well, my philosophy there, that's absolutely what I would recommend. And the reason is you can't leave or dump anything if you don't have it. So a lot of people who go for the ultralight Bugout bag, well, okay, let's say you walk out of the house and your neighbor's got a pickup truck that runs and he says, "Get in, let's go." And you're thinking, "Oh, I don't have to have a 30-pound bag. I could have a 500-pound bag." But you don't. You didn't. You already made the call. Or you're hiking and you just start dumping the stuff then.
Right.
If you have way too much food, well, okay, that's a good problem. Leave it behind. Cache it. Do anything. But I think some people, they imagine their scenario, their Bugout scenario, way too fine a resolution too quickly. Heck, get in shape, and then you can carry 10 more pounds. Or you might share the stuff. Maybe you're going to run into somebody, that you're going to end up kind of befriending, and they don't have much. Well, here, take half my weight. You're twice as strong now.
Right.
But
yeah.
Anyway,
that makes a lot of sense.
A lot of people who worry there.
So let's talk about, so now we're going to talk about long-term though. So first thing is, where do you do it? Now I know for you in Montana, there's tons of places where people aren't and where you got all the natural resources you need, but let's imagine you're in somewhere that's more densely populated. So,
sure.
How far away should it be, and what are the key things you look for in selecting a long-term? I mean, I think we could say, first of all, you should assume that you should have at least a plan of where you're going to go, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I actually made a list. People like lists, and I came up with 12 C's. And these aren't the usual, Bugout bag C's. But they're actually the things that you can run down and say, okay, I've got to deal with these. One of them, the first one is the considerations. And that's essentially identifying the list. The second one would be community. Are you going to be an outsider? Do you have friends? Do you have a group that might take off? Or is the community just your family, or just maybe you and your spouse or significant other or kid? Who's involved in this?
Right.
Because it doesn't work doing it alone. Communication, I think, in this particular situation is critical. You're going to have to know both what's going on and to be able to be in contact with the people in your community. If somebody goes scouting, or, what I call it, there's kind of the hot zone, which is, to use a biological term, the idea of having, an area you want to avoid. That's where stuff's going on. You define that and you stay outside of it. But then when you are doing the Bugout, or you've arrived, you're going to have, to use a robotics term, the work envelope, the area you're going to operate in. You don't leave that area, without good reason. And then that work envelope you can define, and then you can count on whatever resources are in that envelope. So after communication, which, by the way, you've got to follow along. Whether you don't want to be one of those Japanese soldiers crawling out of a pillbox, 25 years
Yeah.
after the war ended.
Well, so I have a question about communication. I mean,
Sure.
what do you do for communication? Assuming if mobile phone networks go down, what are your other communication options?
Well, actually, we just on Survival Cache did a review on the Gotennas. I actually have a set. It'll turn your cell phone into essentially like a texting walkie-talkie, and anyone with one can join into the kind of the community. It's a simple solution that will take your cell phone basically off the cell network. Communication can also be radio. That's a one way, but you're at least tapped into some sort of a bigger picture. Obviously, the family frequency radios are quite helpful in shorter distance line of sight. And sometimes you want to, have people kind of hunker down somewhere safe, and then you might explore forward and do a little recon, and you want to be able to talk to the people, or at least have them listen to what's going on. So those are three quick solutions.
Yeah.
Another is sign language, not the physical like American Sign Language, but to literally work with some arm and hand movements, just like you'd see in traditional operations that
Military,
involve
yeah.
people, military or building clearing, things like that, where they know what something means, and you only need a couple of them. And those are, of course, line of sight, but if you add binoculars to it, now you've got the ability to communicate much further. Do I come forward? Do I hide? Do I stay still? What do I do? And that's, surprisingly helpful. It's how do you read somebody at a distance? Out here, we have a lot of them for hunting, to describe animals, whether you hold your hands above, like a peace sign above your head, okay, we've got a buck somewhere, and then you point to it,
right?
And maybe show a distance. So somebody could be 50 yards away, and you've just identified an animal and a distance, and then maybe even through like sweeping motions with your hand and pointing, you've just described the route you want them to take. And you learn that growing up. That's just how people communicate hunting. But if you have those out, so people are aware that they need to be watching for these things, and you don't want them to yell, what does that mean? You actually are able to guide them, or maybe go around the obstacle, or lay down or be quiet or whatever.
Right.
So those kind of communications, I think are quite important. And that goes into my fourth one, which is children. You might do all the research in the world and build your perfect bug outs, and now you got kids with you. Well, everything is different, and that isn't just the idea of the supplies, but also the psychological well-being. We never went through this. You don't know how you'd react if you're 4, 8, 10, 15. So you have to take into consideration that they didn't cause this. They're going to have to live through this, but basically you want it. You want to be focused on them. A great example of that, I believe, was in that World War Z movie with Brad Pitt. There were times the kids were just freaking out, and you just wanted to, cover their mouths and grab them, but they didn't. They worked with them. They didn't make them feel guilty for messing up. They didn't make the little girl who forgot her medication, feel bad. They weren't going to make it worse. They knew these kids were going crazy, and of course they should, because the whole world's going crazy. It's a movie, but I thought they handled that well, whereas if you watch some of the Doomsday Prepper type stuff, you have, especially the guy up in Alaska, I don't know if you saw that one, basically he was really angry, and his daughter was not having anything about it, and I thought, boy, that's not going to make a nice arrangement. They settled it at the end, but the kids, that's a big deal.
Right. All right, so get back to the C's. So number 4 was...
compound would be the next. Where are you going? And that's that work envelope. Do you have tents? Do you have, some sort of shelter? It can be mobile, it can be a set location, but the compound would be, again, your defendable space. Calories, obviously, food and drink. You can do some dimensional analysis. How many people, how many days, what's the minimum calories, or what kind of support can you get when you're there or on the road. You're just aware that it isn't a 3-day thing. I mean, I listen to the 72-hour bag stuff, and I think 72-hour bag. I don't need anything for 72 hours. You're going to live. Might not be comfortable, but what we need is after that. Another one, a canteen. See, there's your water. What is your source? And you obviously can't carry enough, so canteen, how do I fill it? Where do I fill it? What do I use? What are my options? Another one is consumables. Those are matches, ammo, batteries, anything that has a short life, fuel for your car. What do I use up as I go? Obviously, tents, housing, backpacks, things like that are long term, but there's all sorts of little pieces. And it could even, if it's long term, maybe shoes and socks. How long are those going to last? Another one is cash. Unless there is some sort of weird economic collapse and people don't want it, I think cash is going to have a lot of value, no matter what.
You think
I don't mind
cash like American paper money?
Yep. You pull out $100 bill, and somebody's going to think, well, if this settles down, that's going to actually be worth something. And I said $100 bill. A lot of people say, yeah, get small bills, 5s and 10s, and I'm thinking, yeah, that's holding the continuous value. You might have to overpower somebody with zeros. Can I have that box of ammo? I have 50 rounds of 22. Here's $100. And that's going to change the dynamic. Then somebody says, I'll give you $20 for it. When they start pulling out a couple of 10s. The big bills will always work. The problem is most people think they're going to get change. But $100 is 10 $10 bills. And if the 10 has any value, the 100 has value. So I guess I don't mind having bigger bills as long as, then it becomes a supply issue.
Right.
Because if you come in with the big numbers, if the paper has any value, the more zeros, the more value. I mean, you have to be clear on that. A lot of people are thinking silver and gold. Well, unless you bring a file to grind off, the amount, what are you going to do? You're going to be paying with very large denominations of silver and gold or coins.
Right. Well,
and
plus
if you
they're
even know,
a lot heavier. I mean, that is a lot heavier to carry around with you.
Yeah. Another C is the clean and care. Obviously you're going to have to stay healthy. This could fit first aid, general hygiene, and any necessary issues with any of the people in your community. You can't just run out there because in 2 days, things are going to get pretty messed up. Especially remember, we're talking about going into winter if we use the election idea. So
right.
there's that side of it. The next one, and I say carbine. That's what I alluded to earlier. You're going to make a statement with the gun that you're carrying.
Yeah.
And you want to make that statement. I'm not hunting. I don't have a little, sidearm for personal protection. I am, the tip of the spear. Now, people will argue back and forth on, what kind of an impression you want to make. Mine is, that I'm serious, that you stay away or, join me or whatever, but this isn't messing around. I'm not carrying, an old 12 gauge. This is real. And from a distance, the pattern, we often talk about the AR pattern rifle or the M16 or M4 pattern. That is highly identifiable, and I'm using that as a symbol. Even if it was empty and I was out of ammo, it says something, just its presence. So to me, carbine.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. Now, what would you suggest for, East Coasters like me, where you basically can't have one of those? You're not allowed to have an AR-15 out here for the most part.
Well, there are a couple of ways. One is you can bluff, and that could actually be good. What if you had an airsoft one? or a toy one. I mean, we obviously in a heat of the battle, it's impossible to tell the difference unless you really can zoom in on some aspects of it. If I see somebody running with one, airsoft or anything, it's like I'm getting out of here. I mean, I don't know if you've gone through any active shooter training. I have, and you don't spend a lot of time staring at it saying, "Oh, I see you're using the new PMags and the,
Right.
in the Gen 3 with the window." No, it's like it's like a total panic. You go blank, and you're thinking, "How do I get out of here? How do I barricade?" It's only later that you start to digest those things. So if you're running down the street, obviously you may make yourself a big target. In that case, to a Leo or something. But you can give an appearance. It's like waving a flag. Or the other aspect, when you talk about cities, you obviously don't want to be caught with contraband because there's the very real possibility there will be checkpoints, there will be constriction zones, there will be some way to control and assess. And in that case, you might think, well, what is there any kind of people talk about wasp spray or any sort of a deterrent that gives you some distance,
Right.
And it depends on where you are, but you may have to have some prickliness. I think of porcupines, just what looks like don't touch or stay away or something's wrong or that you just don't want to mess with that person. So what could that be? Sometimes it can be as simple as dirt. It's remember the clean aspect. I don't know if I want to touch that guy. I don't know if I want to be around that person. So what? Just like a homeless person that's just covered in
Yeah.
alley waste, basically. That's my feeling. And
Yeah.
then you're going to see what you want to see. You perceive it as a non-threat, and you perceive it as a kind of a stay away. I don't want what they have. Cough, choke, throw up, whatever makes you undesirable. But ideally, I guess I'd weapon up because if you do encounter something, you probably aren't going to get very many chances.
Yep. Okay, good.
Another one, cutting, chopping.
This is number 11, right, that we're up to?
I think I've got it on 12 here.
Oh, 12.
But maybe I missed. Yeah,
Okay.
Anyway, cutting, chopping, and that depends on your area. I look at it as not only preparing food or game, in my case, but also woodworking, fire, and then, of course, breaching and access. And, if I come up to a fence or something, can I break a lock? Can I get through this? Can I dig under it? You have something much stronger than your hands. Can I break a window? Can I, bend metal? And so I really believe you want some sort of an object that will give you that leverage. If you're in a big city, it's probably going to be more the prying, the hammering, the breaching. Out here, it's going to be the cutting and chopping. And I don't know what I'd breach. There's nothing to breach.
Yeah.
Especially if you're outdoors. So those are really the kind of the C's that I look at and say, okay, I've got to cover all of these. You don't just run because where are you going to go? You don't just grab your kids and leave because you didn't consider your kids. You don't just think, oh, I'll get some food on the way, I'll shoot something. No, you got to plan this out because you don't have a lot of time. A day or two is your buffer.
Right.
And I don't know if you've ever hunted, but sometimes you come back empty, like a lot, or fished. What's your survival buffer? You could spend the night out right now under the stars just fine. November, maybe if I had to dig a hole or something and stay in it, maybe I'd survive a day. The next day is going to be pretty messy. I burned up a ton of calories. I've burned up my buffer. Which, by the way, if you have a big backpack, the backpack can also be a sleeping area too. I don't know if you have ever done that.
No.
A lot of the larger ones, especially with a storm cover, it's kind of a plastic or a nylon tube that comes out of the top of it. You can literally, sleep in a backpack as part of your strategy. So sometimes the little tiny ones, and then people put stuff to sleep inside it. And I'm thinking you can actually use that.
Yeah. So, all right. So
to sleeping pad.
to recap, I've got considerations, community, communication,
Children.
Children, that's the one I missed.
Oh, yeah, children,
And I have children.
psychological
Yeah.
and
Children,
well-being and
yep.
mhm.
Compound, calories, canteen, consumables, cash, clean and care, carbine, and cutting and chopping.
Yep, that's
Yeah.
my list.
Oh, it's a great list. Let me ask you a few other questions then. And so, do you recommend buying some land ahead of time, thinking that this is a place you could go?
Well, that would go into community. If you actually purchase the land and actually spend time, getting to know who else is in the area, even if they're a mile away, um, that is golden. I think there's like even you at the beginning of this mentioned there's a lot of space where there aren't people. Well, there are and there aren't. We're already here. There aren't a lot of places you can be totally alone, but you might, like I do a lot of mountaineering and climbing, and you run into people on the summits of mountains. They don't live there, but they're like-minded. They're out doing these things. But if you buy land and then expect you're going to go, stay on it, if there really is the true scenario for a long-term bug out, why do you think that the laws of land ownership are going to hold any water? I mean, you become kind of a threat in some ways. You're an unknown. You came in, and we have that a lot, and it includes not only wealthy people who buy ranches, but Colombian drug lords that buy large tracts of land and then put in their own airstrip. That happens here in Montana. Drug properties, that's big in Colorado. That's a lot of reasons people carry a gun while they're hiking, is they aren't worried about animals. They're worried about stumbling on somebody's pot farm. But why do you think that that's going to serve a purpose unless you accent that purpose by showing up, by meeting people, by talking to the local store or whatever, buying stuff locally? Don't go to Walmart in the big city and save money. Go to the small place. Introduce yourself. You're going to be a known quantity, and honestly, you can end up in a roadblock. I've had that actually happen when there was a forest fire. 2 Humvees, blocking the road. You had to be a resident to be allowed up this highway. So I could easily see that. There was no way around it.
Right.
But if you're an unknown, you don't know anybody, nobody knows you, what good is that? Otherwise, here we've got tons of places you could, if you knew the area, could go that nobody owns. I mean, it's federal land, state or federal land. That's no problem. Any national forest, any BLM, state land, even university land.
Yeah.
But the problem, of course, is what makes you think you're going to be secured just because you have a title in your name, any more than your car is secure because you bought it. It could still be carjacked, stolen, wrecked, vandalized, whatever. And same with the land. But if you buy it with the idea of I'm going to become part of this community, I mean, that's the second C. Actually, it's the first C because I called considerations to make sure that the list was self-contained. It's really big. Who are you going to ask when there's a problem? What if you run into somebody? You out there. Can you drop a name? Can you explain who you are? How do I know, being here that you're not adding to my threat list?
Right.
So, but if you're
This
in a
is the
larger
big
city,
problem,
yeah,
but anywhere on the East Coast, like where I live in New Jersey, I mean, right outside New York, you'd have to go a pretty long way, to get where it's not so populated. You'd have to go,
yeah,
40 miles west or 50 miles west. So,
yeah. And I think what people forget to realize is that there are people already living in that area. It's the new kind of security blanket public service announcement that's going on right now. If you see something, say something, because only you know what your normal is. I even, if I'm in town, you can kind of see that car doesn't look right. Oh, it's got Arizona plates on it. Well, there was something wrong about it. The wheels were too fancy. It was too clean. There was something. And the police pick up on that. I imagine that the out-of-staters get pulled over more. They stand out. But if I go to Phoenix, they're going to be like, what's that dump of a pickup truck that's all dirty driving around here for with tires that are that have knobs on them instead of road tread? you just know what your normal is. So if you show up and you've got that fancy Cadillac SUV, something's wrong.
Right.
But if you've been there before, if people can wave at you and you know how to wave back, you know, which is a big deal. Do you know how to respond? Do you know what eye contact is normal? I mean, all these things. Then you're okay. Heck, carry on. But if I'm seeing, and we have this here, we even have it now, where out-of-staters come in and they kind of go up on a hike and sort of cut down some trees and maybe cache some stuff. There, you can tell they're preparing, and I'm thinking that's my area. I go there, a lot, and I'm seeing what you're doing, and you think you're invisible because you're never there. And go in and remove everything and put it back the way it was and take out their markers and think, gosh, don't you understand? So a lot of people see emptiness. It's not empty. So that is where owning land could be important. And if you were in a bigger city, if you could go out and you had an acre and you knew the guy who was next to you, you'd be okay and you'd work together. But if you think that nobody's squatting in that barn, so it's fair game, unless you know something about its history, there's a good chance that somebody is watching you and is saying that's a threat.
Yeah. So would you recommend more just having a few different areas that you would go to depending on what's happening? Would that be a better way?
I would recommend 3 in 3 different directions.
Yeah.
And that all depends on where you're living. You obviously, if you're up against a coast, one of those directions could be a boat. But also, it's the idea of where, if it's a natural disaster or if it's a moving threat, do you have a direction? Because if everything's north for you and you've got to go south, you're out of luck. But if you had something kind of southeast or southwest, just even, a place you've gone and camped, just something to get you started, that's better. But a lot of folks really don't plan beyond this imaginary, what they call it, the great readout, the Wesley, or the author of Patriots, the Idaho, the Wyoming, the Montana. You just go there, and I'd like to stress we're already here.
Right.
I mean, we're already aware of this. Yeah, you could hide in places, sure. You can camp next to the river, but we see these things. We live here. Just like you might notice, there's a transient hanging out in this corner, that there's usually somebody else, or there's nobody, or you just are aware of it. Me, I wouldn't notice. You, yeah, or a car. It's something different about that. Or somebody sitting on the steps, and you're thinking that's odd. And I've been to cities where things just didn't seem right because they weren't right. I had to take off running in D.C. once in the middle of the night when somebody was trying to sell me newspapers, and I was kind of dense, and the person I was with said, the newspapers aren't for sale right now, run.
Yeah.
I was trying to close the distance. Hey, want to buy a newspaper or sell a newspaper? And I'm like, huh, what? And that set it off. That never happens. To me, yeah, I've had that happen. I mean, I've been in bars in the middle of the night and, at 1 a.m. and the newspapers are coming out. I remember that years ago. But it didn't make sense in their world. Luckily, they were around, or I might not be here.
Right.
So there's lots of ways, and that's why community is important. Make a presence. Even if you say, I just got some land in case I ever need to come and set up a tent or stay here, and whenever you're in town, you buy locally, talk to people. People, they'll recognize that car. Even 5 years later, oh yeah, I saw that Cadillac SUV. Recognize it.
Right.
Or that Bob, he's odd. He's from a big city, but he comes out every once in a while. You're just part of it.
Yeah, yeah. And then in closing minutes here, because we've been talking a long time, what about, if something goes on for a really long time and you're talking about having to, rebuild society and plant crops?
That's when you better have some skills. And that's your personal survival skills, but also what can you contribute? Generally, you aren't able to do this totally on your own anymore. We've kind of, I don't know if we've evolved past that. Some people are more, can do a greater percentage totally on their own, but most of the time we have to interact, we have to trade, we have to, somehow rely on each other. And it could be from a diversification of diet. You can't just fish. You're going to have to count on the farmer who's growing some greens. Or you have to have some tradable skill. I can blacksmith, or I can work with animals, or I can grow crops or fix whatever. Or you're an engineer and you can build something, or an architect, or whatever. It's deep down, what are your skill sets? And I meet so many people who really don't have anything very deep. They've never worked on a car or a tractor or anything. They haven't gardened. They rely on the technology to do a lot of the work. One thing, to stop scaring people about that, is to build what I call a book bunker. And that's a collection of physical, not on your Kindle, but physical books dealing with survival scenarios, with gardening, with mechanics, with blacksmithing, with just basically it's like a time capsule, if you will, of potential skills that you could take some time and learn. Do you know how to make clothes? Do you know how to turn a tree into lumber? Do you know how to grow food? Work with irrigation, anything, and you don't have to know it. Although that would be good, but that's unrealistic. And you build up your resource, your personal library that says, okay, these are going to help me, or I can share them. Let's say you have a group of people with no skills or limited skills, or everybody's got the same skill. They can all shoot really well. It's one I hear quite often. I'm really good at security, and it's like, great,
Right.
You can't eat it. It's say, okay, here, figure out how to, grow more fish in this pond. What do we need to do? Or how do we prepare the garden? Or hunt. I mean, a lot of people imagine hunting is walking around and you shoot something. Yeah, great, if it was that easy, which it's not. But you can read some books and get some huge benefit, about moving slowly, about tracking, about, predicting animal behavior, about just understanding that if you sit still for 2 hours, things move by. But most people can't sit still. They have to go out and look. Well, the animal's way more in tune to what's going on, and they're going to see you a mile away. You aren't going to see anything, even though they're all around you. So, I have piles of books that, are in all sorts of different arrangements, depending, even the old stuff, the kind of the old wood lore and wisdom, and how to build a sod shack, or there's lots of stuff there. I'm not going to read them now, but I might need them, or I might need to give them to somebody else, and that's when you can start building those skill sets. So in answer to the question, if it's long term like that, yeah, you've got to have your buffer supplies, but then also move forward into what can I contribute? What is my advantage to this community, or what advantage can I provide? And we might all have things. It could be you're just really nice. You listen. You're the town shrink. The kids need somebody to talk to, and you just happen to be good at that. And it might be because everyone else is too into guns and shooting, and you're just into listening and talking and working through problems, because there's going to be a big need for that, the social aspect. Cooking. Maybe you're big and dumb and you can split wood all day long. All right, you're golden.
Yeah.
Or maybe you're weak, but you've got institutional knowledge. I mean, yeah, you could have a copy of the Constitution in your back pocket, like a lot of people do. But do you understand if you need to set up some sort of an organization in your community? Who knows how to do that?
Right.
And somebody might say, "Oh, I know that. I'm a lawyer." Well, okay, what? At first, you would have been the first one I'd throw out, but you actually have a place here because now you can help us get along.
Right. Yeah, makes sense. I mean, it's funny how most skills are skills that are totally not applicable if if it was the end of society as we know it, 99% of the skills we've learned mean nothing. I mean, certainly my ability to get the proper exposure on a camera is useless.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, but what you might understand is aesthetics, and that may keep people happy. They want to be in a place, or you're moving things around, and there's something more more encouraging. You see that in the military isn't necessarily that way because it's sort of a forced existence. But if you've got let's say you're bugging out, it isn't dumb to plant flowers. It isn't dumb to clean up an area, to make things look nice. It helps you stay positive, and in some ways art keeps us going. It's not just food, it's purpose and reason and meaning and what we're carrying forward. And the kids are going to really need that. So in some ways you could say, well, yeah, I understand I don't have a camera that works anymore, so exposure, but you understand composition and elements of design, and you're going to make the place happy. I mean, we pay people to do that, to walk in and change the the feng shui of things. Otherwise, people are going to get cranky and angry, and it's going to feel like a prison, and you're not going to want to be there or help out. There's no purpose. There's no positive future. And so, it might be you that's the one that figures this out, saying this is really a depressing situation. I remember posting that. It was one of the first comments I ever posted on Survival Cache way back. They did a review on a tent, and the tent was dark green. And my comment was, in mountaineering, when you're stuck in a storm for days in a tent, you like bright colors. It keeps you going. But this whole camo and dark green and dark brown and black, it does depress you. So if you're around it all the time, that's why our houses don't look like that.
Right.
Our rifles might, but our houses don't. So you have to think about, how can I force myself to be more positive? And you can trick yourself in. You get a bright yellow tent or a bright orange tent or in my case, it's a kind of a golden tent, mimics sunlight. And that helps. It sometimes it throws you off, but other times it's like, this is great. I'm not sad. But you climb into a dark cavern and it ruins everything. So, in some ways those skills are not maybe the most obvious. And do you have any first aid skills? Any water skills of any kind? From swimming to irrigation to anything. And you might think, well, yeah, I've done that, or I did that in high school. Okay, you've got a skill that somebody else might not have. I meet all these folks from Alaska that can't swim. You're thinking, what? Yeah.
Right.
Why would you swim in northern Alaska?
Yeah, no way
And you're thinking, you're coming down here, and now we're out on this adventure. We're in a mountain lake, and you can't swim. And now you've got to be careful. You can't cross rivers. You can't, watch out when you're walking on logs. I mean, this is a big liability.
Right.
So we need a swim instructor right now because we're in Minnesota and we might end up in the water. So it's things like that.
Well, thanks, Doc. I think that was really, really valuable. We'll be back again with Doc and Mark next week. Topic TBD.
You've been listening to the Survivalist Podcast with Mark Puhalle and Matt Gould. Brought to you by Survival Cache, Ford Survival Supply, and theBugoutRace.com. Please visit our website, thesurvivalistpodcast.com. This show is produced by Chad Dugatz at the Hangar Studios in New York City.